The MBR research question review article, I think, is one of the most useful articles, particularly for practitioner scholars who are starting out on the research process. Effectively, what it does is it identifies all the research literature that is focused on answering a very specific practical research question, normally driven by some business problem, and provides a very short summary of the key takeaways of each article. And this type of search can feed into other types of articles and into doctoral dissertations. And it's a good exercise in terms of using the library. And so it is something that doctoral students just starting out can reasonably consider doing. Now, the overview of the research question review, we expect it to identify an interesting research question that's of practical importance to manager. We call it a research question here because we are attempting to publish research directed at practitioners, but it's also could be considered a business problem. It presents a summary of the results of a systematic search of the research literature that relates to that particular question. And normally you're going to present this in tabular form so that a reader can very quickly go through and get a sense of what all the different conclusions are that might be associated with this research. It highlights the key takeaways of the research, and among the most important of these might be conclusions that are broadly agreed upon and conclusions where a lot of conflict exists. And you can find both in the typical literature that deals with a specific research question. It should also identify the strengths and weaknesses of the literature in terms of addressing the question being selected. And normally it's going to be around 5 to 15 pages, like most of the other standard MBR submissions, and that's template pages. But most of it we expect will consist of a table. When a reviewer looks at an MBR research question review submission, there are going to be a number of things that they're looking for. First and foremost, is the question being asked important, or is it just something that's easy to find answers on? The next thing is the degree to which the results seem to offer value to researchers and particularly to managers, and the value could derive from two very different sources. In one case, you might find research findings that are consistent and provide very novel insights into business practice. On the other hand, you might find research that is very conflicting and offers very little value in addressing significant questions, either because the results are so obvious or because there are so many different sets of results that you really can't come up with any consistent viewpoint. The findings should be presented in a manner likely to engage readers. Now, this is one article that we wouldn't necessarily expect them to read cover to cover, since much of it is a table. So rather than necessarily engaging readers throughout the article, what you want to do is make a very strong presentation of why the question is important, and then make it very easy for readers to find what they're looking for and to get the highlights of the research. And I think this is very important because many practitioners are very interested in what the research says. They're just not all that interested in going through the research itself. Finally, we're looking for the degree to which we expect this to contribute to business and managerial knowledge. And this might not necessarily be the same as a contribution to the research literature, because what we're trying to do is communicate the findings in a clear way. And if the research literature does not communicate the findings in a clear way, we can add value simply by communicating that which has already been discussed in the research literature. Because remember, the MUMA Business Review is intended to provide an outlet that is accessible to practitioners. So if you're presenting something that has never been presented in a manner clearly before to practitioners, then there's value there. The instructions for using the template are basically the same as all the other templates. You save this document under a new name so you don't erase the template. You delete the instructions page once you're ready. Use the styles that are embedded in the document. And most important, fill in the reviewer appendix, because the reviewer appendix is where you really make the case that this research question review was created in a very rigorous fashion, and that's what you really need to do if you're going to get published in the MUMA Business Review. It's not enough for it just to be engaging. It also has to suggest that you've really paid attention to identifying the appropriate research for the question you're asking. The cover page for the research question review follows the same format as the other MBR templates. You have a title, you have a tagline, and the tagline is 25 to 50 words that captures the essence of what it is you're investigating, the research question and key conclusions. The tagline is going to appear on the cover of the journal when the article is listed. It's going to appear on the website, which lists the articles in the journal. It may go out on a Twitter feed. It may go out on a Facebook feed. And so it's really important that you write a tagline that captures the reader's interest so that they click to look at the whole article. The keywords are principally for researchers. After the article is published, the keywords will help when a search engine is going out doing a search in identifying that the article is relevant to that search. So it basically helps us find the articles on the web more than anything else. And the executive summary is the one thing on the cover page that will in fact appear in the article itself. It's a 150 to 250 word summary that captures the importance of the research question being asked and highlights some of the key conclusions that we got from our research survey. Once again, if the executive summary is not engaging, it's the very rare reader who will go on to read the article itself. So the research question review body is relatively simple because the meat and potatoes of this particular research type is a table containing findings. But normally you're going to begin with an introduction that just briefly describes how you came up with the research question that you're interested in. This should motivate the reader. Then a very brief protocol describing how you went through the literature. And you really don't want this to be very long. A much more systematic version of this is going to be included in the reviewer appendix. So as a result, it should be just enough to convince the reader that you actually did a systematic study of the research and aren't simply cherry picking a few articles and claiming that's a good summary. Now, the summary itself, I encourage you to make use of tables. We're not going to specify a specific format that you have to use. I've given a couple of examples, but there's some variation that you might use. Now, one example here is one where you essentially have a variety of different sources that all come up with similar findings or support the same findings. So in this case, we'll make the finding the left column, and that's going to be that key thing of the table, and then we'll just put references in APA format over here. The author's names and the years is typically the way you do that, so you can get a lot of references like that here. And so here's where you got a lot of different sources, all of which have similar findings as you go through the literature. Now, an alternative way of presenting it is where each article is significant. So if you're choosing the most significant articles in the literature, and in the reviewer appendix, you might identify how you chose the articles. For example, you might choose the 50 most cited articles dealing with that research question, or some criteria such as that. And here each article counts, so you'll give the full reference for the article here, or the author, the year, and the title. And then you'll list the findings, and normally there'll be more than one. Since you're doing each article by itself, you're going to basically have a number of findings in many cases. Really, which of these is more appropriate depends on how many articles that you're searching. And I have a couple of examples from some academic articles that I wrote. For example, in this particular case, there were a lot of different research articles that used complexity in the same way. So I organized them according to a classification scheme that I developed. I described each classification, and then I identified the research that dealt with that. Now, in a different version, I was looking at an article by article survey. In this case, I identified the central theme of the research, how the research was conducted, and if there's a big variation in the type of research you're looking at. Some of it might be empirical research based on data, some of it might be theoretical research, some of it might be simulation, then it might be worth adding a research type column. Here I gave the implications of each individual article and a reference here. Now I have the reference here over in the right column, but I could have done the reference on the left column just as easily, which is what I suggested in the example table. Really, the format you choose is up to you, and it's going to be driven, as I said, by the nature of the research that you're finding. Now, whereas in a literature review, in a traditional dissertation or academic paper, you're going to be doing a ton of analysis along the way as you review the literature. Here, we're really just more interested in letting the literature speak for itself, but you as the author in the discussion section should do things like identify where the literature is fairly consistent, where it's inconsistent. You might highlight some key points if your tables are very large. If there's a theory that you want to bring in, you can do that, but I would suggest that for the most part in this article, what we're trying to do is we're trying to let the manager reviewer who already knows a lot about the business look at the results and draw his or her own conclusions rather than attempting to force a particular conclusion on them. What we're really doing here is making them more confident that what they're doing is based on the literature, or that at least they're familiar enough with what the literature says so that they don't feel guilty that they might have missed something. Finally, your conclusions should be kind of a summary of the key takeaways, as conclusions always are, and what you want to do is try to make them internally consistent and not require a lot of reading of the paper to understand them, because people will look at the executive summary, they'll look at the conclusions, and then maybe they'll decide if it's worth looking at the paper itself. The reviewer appendix is not going to be included in the article itself, but it is the way that the reviewers of your article determine whether rigorous research methods have been applied, in this case, in identifying and summarizing the literature. So you'll normally start out by explaining how you came up with the question that you decided to study. Is this something that you came up with because it was something that was of personal interest to you and your organization, or is it something that was inspired by the literature? We simply want to understand where you're coming from here. What's probably most significant for this particular article type is the nature of the review that you are conducting. So we want to understand what databases you searched, Did you look at references with an initial set of articles and sort of use them to identify other important articles in the field? If you did not include all the articles in your search, which will normally be the case because many times the search will produce many articles, what were the criteria that you used for not including those articles? And what process did you use to summarize the articles? So here, what we're basically trying to do is we're trying to get a very clear sense of where your list came from and how you came up with the quick descriptions of each item on the list. Your discussion and conclusions should be relatively self-evident. If there's anything that is not self-evident in the paper about the discussion and conclusions, you can include it here. And if you decided not to try to synthesize the findings, more or less just stopping with the table and jumping right to conclusions, then you might explain why you did not feel it was necessary to have further discussion. Finally, as with all the templates, you want to make sure that you have permissions for everything that you use. In this particular type of article, you're probably not going to be dealing with images or other things, but you do want to make sure that if you do any quoting, that you clearly identify the source so that you're not putting yourself open for plagiarism. And as I say, when you submit your article, you will be certifying that you have permission to use everything that you've included. So as a consequence, you want to make sure that you do in fact have permission for everything you've included.